Hello, I'm Theo Knight-Jones. In this talk, we will explain how we move from a value chain assessment to a risk assessment. This process sits within this step one of our risk analysis value chain approach. We have done a situational analysis, sketched different value chains, identified the actors that are relevant for these value chains which we're interested in, to do with foot and mouth disease control and its spread, mapped out the routes of livestock. Now we're going to start to identify the risk hotspots where foot and mouth disease transmission is greatest and the impact is greatest. So in identifying risk hotspots, we will look at each value chain and then look for opportunities for foot and mouth disease transmission within that value chain, or introduction into a new area or zone or country, and try to identify where these greatest burdens of risk are occurring, and the most important areas for foot and mouth disease epidemiology. So at each node within the value chain we're looking at, we will ask, can foot and mouth disease virus enter here, and look at different routes and sources that the virus could spread through. Will the virus survive here? It could be if we're considering an animal product, that part of the processing of that product would inactivate it and reduce risk without us doing anything in addition. Would foot and mouth disease be noticed here? So is there a risk of it spreading unnoticed, or is it going to be controlled by processes already there? So this could be, for example, in certain livestock, such as sheep, they display fewer clinical signs, so there's a greater risk of foot and mouth disease spreading or existing unnoticed. And then we'll look, can foot and mouth disease spread from this node to other areas of the value chain, or even into other value chains. So risk hotspots are the most important concentrations of risk in disease transmission or disease introduction in our value chains. And by knowing where these big risks occur, we can prioritize where we should put our control efforts, and this should guide our mitigation measures and control measures and strategy where we want to apply it. Now, I keep on mentioning risk. Now, what do I mean here when I mention risk? Well, we're talking about two things. Firstly, what is the probability of the unwanted event happening? So what is the probability of, for example, foot and mouth disease entering this new zone we're considering? But not only the probability, we also want to consider, if it did happen, how severe are the consequences of that happen? Because you may have something that's quite likely, but it's not such a big impact if it did happen. But then you may have something that's perhaps less likely. Foot and mouth disease entering a free zone may happen very infrequently, but when it does happen, it's a very big consequence. So this should be prioritized as a high risk event. And when I use the word probability, we will use other words similar to mean the same thing. So the chances of something happening, the probability of it happening, the likelihood of it happening, we use interchangeably. So risk hotspots. So it could be a geographical area which we think is particularly important for foot and mouth disease transmission and its impact. It could be a certain activity that stakeholders, such as farmers, are doing that is high risk. For example, animal markets, if they're not well controlled, there's a risk of spread and transmission. Common grazing, there's again another risk for animals to transmit and spread disease among themselves. When considering these hotspots, we may want to do it separately for considering foot and mouth disease entry into a country or area, and then consider it again separately for foot and mouth disease spread within this, once it's within an area. It may already be in the area. So in the top right, we have a map of Turkey, and I'll just describe some of the sorts of things we are considering. So most of Turkey is endemic for foot and mouth disease, Anatolia, but it does have an FMD free with vaccination zone here. Along its eastern borders, there's borders a number of FMD endemic countries, several areas where there is political and civil instability, which always promotes animal disease transmission, among many other things. So you have a risk of foot and mouth disease entering Turkey here, new strains, for example, and this is also drawn by higher prices often in Turkey. In these areas, in the east of the country, they have a lot of grazing and grazing of cattle and production of young calves. Common grazing, often with mountain grazing, where animals in summer would go up and maybe even travel hundreds of miles to access different grazing. The young animals, then those that are going to be fattened, are often then transported to areas where there's lots of fattening farms nearer the high population densities, so the consumption centres. So there's big cities here and up here, which, as you can see, is nearer the free zone. So there is a sort of flow of animals from that area across the country. And what's more, this may happen more at particular times of year where there's higher risk. So the Kurban Festival, Festival of Sacrifice, then there's very large flows of foot and mouth disease susceptible stock in this direction generally for consumption on this particular festival. And so you can see there's a number of practices here which could well be identified as foot and mouth disease hotspots. And we'll describe soon about how we actually define and identify these hotspots. And in this movement, again, we're also going to be particularly concerned about risks of foot and mouth disease entering a free zone up there in the northwest Thrace. So when we're looking at foot risk hotspots, we will look at the probability or likelihood of foot and mouth disease transmission or impact occurring. So you might ask yourself, which do you think are the most risky practices within our value chains, looking at different nodes? So as referring to that example, there's certain times when there's lots of mixing of different animals from different origins, which we know you can mix different susceptibilities, can favor outbreaks. Also, when multiple value chains converge, so for example, you may have a dairy sector, which is very susceptible to the impacts of foot and mouth disease. And in a similar area, there may be extensive sheep production, where foot and mouth disease detection may be lower, and on the whole they may be separated, but there may be situations where they come into close contact where there's real risks of transmission, whether it be through markets or shared workers or shared grazing. This could also be another hotspot. And we're also interested, obviously, where there's poor biosecurity and control measures to limit the spread of the disease. But as mentioned with risk, we're also considering the impact and the consequences if there was transmission there and foot and mouth did arise. So things that are going to relate to a bigger impact are the size, the number of animals that will be affected. For example, if you have a country or zone you're considering and there's only one animal market, okay, that might be risks going on in that market, but it's going to be bigger risk if you're looking at another zone where there's hundreds of markets, and this process is happening all the time, and there's a more prominent activity, greater flows and greater risks. And also potential spread. So you may get into be worried about foot-and-mouth disease entering in a zone or an area where there's at the moment lots of common grazing, for example. You might be particularly worried or maybe transboundary movements of animals, and if it gets there, a new strain gets into there, it may have potential to spread quickly and beyond boundaries. Obviously, for impact, we're considering the economic losses. So often dairy is seen as a sector that's susceptible to the impacts of foot-and-mouth disease more than some others. Pigs are often severely affected as well. Also social impact. So if for a particular reason, uncontrolled foot-and-mouth disease, or a perception that not enough is being done to control foot-and-mouth disease causes big political consequences, as it will do in some areas more than others, this is going to be a bigger consequence. So typical hotspots you might have here are, say, uncontrolled borders, a risk of FMD entry into the country, markets, particularly if there's poor biosecurity or movement controls for allowing the transmission of the virus, not just locally, but maybe even long distance movements as well. Again, slaughter points could be, but there's going to be many others, and they're such as common grazing, and they don't just have to be these sort of activities. It could be, as we mentioned, geographical areas where we know for one reason or another foot-and-mouth disease has a high risk in that area that plays a big role in the epidemiology. Or it could be a certain time of the year promoting it, risk within an activity. So shifting from this value chain analysis, where we've, similar to this diagram below, we've mapped out the flows of animals or products and who's involved, and then we need to try and think now about how will foot-and-mouth disease and how can foot-and-mouth disease spread within these value chains. And we do this by transferring it into a table, basically, where we screen some of these risks in this preliminary risk assessment. So we'll first, for a value chain, consider what is the risk of foot-and-mouth disease introduction into the country or area. And so here we're screening different possible ways that foot-and-mouth disease can enter. So consider live animals, animal products, other fomites, and you may have other means of spread that you consider. When we identify a movement or flow of animals that's relevant, we'll then identify some of the risk factors that affect this risk. So it could be, for example, we mentioned movement of animals across the country, and this is greater at certain times of year. We'll estimate that risk, and there's been some talk about terminology to categorize this risk. In this table here is saying high or medium or low. It's just a preliminary risk, but it's just to give us a basis to move on to the next steps. And then we identify some of the questions and unknowns that are relevant to this, and maybe things we want to know more about, or just some comments that are relevant to this. After doing introduction, considering the factors that are relevant to introduction of FMD into the country or area, we'll look at factors that are relevant for exposure of local livestock. So for those of you who are familiar with risk assessment, this is very much mirroring this approach. You consider risk of the hazard, here for foot-and-mouth disease, entry into your country or area, and then we consider risks of exposure of here local livestock to this hazard, foot-and-mouth disease, and considering the different potential routes of transmission, different carriers, live animals, animal products. Then we're looking for what can facilitate further spread within that area, and at the bottom, then onward spread to other areas. So we'll be considering ways that the disease could spread. So live animals we know is an important transmitter of foot and mouth disease. They share the largest amounts of virus. Animal products can also be contaminated, and you'll want to consider that. But in that, with animal products, you also have to consider, will susceptible species then be exposed to potentially contaminated products? Swill feeding in pigs is a common route in some countries. But also fomite, so you'll need to consider the levels of cleansing and disinfection, and how people share equipment, and also movement of people. If there's lots of people working in different premises in certain settings or visiting each other, these will all be relevant. It is, when we're thinking about consequences and impact, again, if you're in an endemic country where there's a high, in an early stage with lots of virus transmission within an area, then there'd be lots of potential for virus transmission, and so you're going to focus on the priority areas that are causing the biggest burden of transmission. At the other extreme, if you have a free area, you're still going to be very, very worried about a small probability of FMD entering via fomite because of the massive consequences. So that it does change your risks depending on your PCP situation. So here are some examples. And this is just to give a brief idea. It's not comprehensive. When you're doing this in a real exercise, you'll do a lot more. So looking at foot and mouth disease, introduction to an area and the risks. So here in this top row, we're considering live animals, and something that could affect the live. We know there's a risk of live animals. So something that could affect the risk is, we know that there are laws to ban import of cattle in this particular area we're considering. But we're going to put risk as medium because we know there are informal or illegal movements across the border. And we'd like to better understand the incentives that's driving people to move livestock across the border, trade incentives typically. So that's just an example, and you could put more and expand on that. Then moving to the next step, exposure of local livestock. So once we're considering the risk of the foot and mouth disease virus entering this area, will local livestock be exposed to the virus? So here again, I'm considering live animals in this little summary. And we know that, so factors affecting risk, we know that imported livestock are kept with local cattle in this border region, so we know there's mixing. So the risk estimates of local animals being exposed if virus was present is high because of this mixing. And we've also mentioned here that there's no vaccination going on as well. But we'd like to better understand when these risks are highest by knowing the locations and timings of animal movements. Next step, so spread of FMD within the area. Actually, so here I've added not just considering live animals, but a couple of points on animal products. So we know there's mixing. So here we're looking at not only animals exposed to the virus at some level, but there's how big is this potential spread of foot and mouth disease within the area. So there's lots of mixing of animals at common grazing, unreliable vaccination campaigns, looking at products, infected animals and diseased animals could go to slaughter in this hypothetical scenario I'm describing, where because the inspection is not happening properly. There is a risk of manure being spread. Foot and mouth disease can survive in manure. Risk of transmission is lower than in live animals, but these are all things we'll consider in more detail later on. And so given all these potential for spread, I'm going to say the risk here is high. And I haven't filled in the questions, but there will be questions. This is just an example. to give you an idea. And then we're looking at risk of spread beyond this area to other areas. So here I've just given an example with live animals. So local and imported cattle are transported to markets across the country, and particularly near the big cities, the consumption areas. And that happens on a regular basis at a high level. So the risk estimate is high. So please do the reading as well, but this just helps give you a quick overview of what we're considering in this step of the process of risk analysis for long and value chains. Thank you.